His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, a podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I'm your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. We're still in the middle of our oral history mini-series, talking with Rob Annan of the Long Island Library Resources Council as we take a tour through collections from Long Island institutions that he's helped digitize. We've got a few more lined up, ready to go. I'm researching, listening to a lot of interviews. One great one I'll just tease was the narrator, the person being interviewed. He was framing his memories based around his paper route in the 1950s. So look for those coming up soon. But today we are zooming out a little. I thought it might be interesting to talk a little more about oral history itself. Maybe what you've been listening to has sparked an interest in you, or you're part of a library that is about to embark on a collection. So in order to give us all a quick lesson in how to do it, how to get yourself in the mindset, all the things you have to think about before you even sit down behind the mic, I sat down behind the mic with today's very special guest.
Hello, my name is Erica Fugger. I'm an oral historian and peace educator. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Rutgers University, Newark.
Erica, first of all, thank you for joining us. We are talking over Libsyn Connect. And just for full disclosure, we worked together on a project before, an oral history project, but we're taking a bit of a side quest from our deep dive into Long Island-based oral history collections to kind of get a wider context. So thank you for being our oral history expert for the evening.
Very grateful to be here. Thank you so much.
The other side thing is I just recently spoke with a woman in Australia getting her PhD. So how is your PhD journey going?
Well, I always say that my PhD was my pandemic project. I started in the fall of 2020, kind of at the height of COVID. And, it was an interesting journey because I didn't get to meet some of my classmates in person for a whole year. But I've had a wonderful experience at Rutgers Newark. And I'm just at the dissertating phase now and getting to dive into my own oral history. So it's been a lot of fun.
Oh, great.
I've learned a lot.
So we're meeting up at a good time, I think. Can you, how about this, explain how you got into this world of oral history? What was your introduction to it? What made you pursue it as a field?
So, I grew up in an interesting historical and political time. At least that's the way I think of it. I came of age post 9/11. And I think for us millennials around that time, there was really a sense that it was important to kind of understand the moment that we were existing in. I was kind of always searching for some meaning and identity in the world. And I found that the study of history and listening to reflections of those who experienced it firsthand, really kind of contextualize that moment we were in. So I had a really wonderful group of educators who made me passionate about American history, but also kind of encouraged me to kind of question some of the mainstream narratives. And so I was grateful to after college, be able to go on to study in the oral history program at Columbia University. That kind of set me on my path of working in archives and conducting interviews and eventually working on the project that we met through Chris, the National Homefront Project. I'm happy to go in more depth about that initiative as well.
So what is it about, or what is one thing about oral history as a pursuit that you like or you appreciate, either as a source or as a methodology? What is it, or what do you think is one of the selling points, for lack of a better term, of oral history?
Yeah, I feel that, in a society like ours, so fast-paced, and we often don't have an opportunity to just sit down with our loved ones and kind of hear the story of where they came from and what times they grew up in. And I feel like that's also very important for, communities to really know about their past and to be able to connect over kind of shared history and heritage. But oral history as a methodology is very important for historians as well, because only certain sets of stories are represented sometimes in archival collections. And so having that opportunity to expand the historical record, to really sit down with someone and to hear their story in a very vulnerable and beautiful way, I think is so important for our society today.
And just to get in some of the historical context, you mentioned Columbia, which is an important name in oral history. Would you say oral history is sort of a mid-20th century development in terms of its use and acceptance in study of history? And if so, do you want to just tell us briefly how Columbia played into that?
Yes. So, the story goes that Alan Nevins, who was a journalist and historian at Columbia University, he founded one of the first institutional archives of oral history in 1948. It was called the Oral History Research Office. He felt that with the advent of new technologies like the telephone, there were not as many written sources by elites, big decision makers. They used to kind of correspond and have letters. So it's going to be more difficult for historians to analyze major historical events and kind of their contributions to society. And especially also with the advent of reel-to-reel recorders, that made documenting personal narratives a lot easier at the time. But many scholars have begun to challenge kind of this framing of the history of oral history. It's also, really integral to the cultural memory and heritage in many societies. So even though the field of oral history kind of thinks that it had its founding at Columbia University, there's some larger origin stories that scholars are starting to explore. And I'll just say quickly, there was the New Deal initiative, the Federal Writers Project, which was already collecting these kind of stories before Alan Nevins. But, overall, with our modern technology, we can generally say that oral history began, yes, mid-20th century.
I'll just echo that the Federal Writers Project, they were doing things like documenting slave narratives, so there were still living people who had memories of being enslaved or the children of enslaved people. I know there's transcripts of those WPA, but is that mostly a written record at this point?
Good question. I believe that it is mostly a written record. Some of the challenges to those early oral histories were that the recording technology was so expensive, and oftentimes, the interviews were recorded over each other. And historians kind of thought that the written document was the actual source. But now we've come a ways since then, and I wish some of those older stories had actually been recorded, but you can still read them, and I think it's a very powerful, important part of our national history.
Yeah, and just for your benefit, one of the projects we talked about was from Manhasset Public Library that was done in the 1950s. So to your mind, is that interesting to you that a public library would have had the equipment and the wherewithal to actually be recording in the 50s? It's pretty early in the timeline.
Absolutely. That is very early. I would say that in the history of oral history, we kind of think of the 1960s as being more of the time where kind of these community projects started forming. So the fact that a library was recording those stories, and I listened to your podcast episode about it as well, and it sounded like it was local residents, who were born in the 1870s, and that's just truly phenomenal to have begun this oral history journey so early on and be able to record that history. So I think it is a little bit unusual for kind of like a local organization to be doing that.
Yeah, so what do you, going through the timeline, has oral history already gone through a few phases where it was sort of hot for a while and then not so many projects? Does it go in waves, do you think?
I think so. I think probably between the 1930s and 1950s, that's when you have these larger institutional projects like at Columbia University, or the government initiatives like the Federal Writers Project. Probably between the 1960s and 80s, it was a time of great change in American society, and many community organizations started setting up their own oral history projects, also kind of activist groups as well, to document kind of their efforts and even use interviewing as a form of organizing. So I think oral history became this hub for communities to really listen to each other, to record the stories of everyday people and learn more about the local history and heritage, and explore some of their kind of shared experiences. And this is also a time where public history as a field was becoming more professionalized, and you kind of saw the rise of historical consultations in places like museums, historical societies, often the government, and that's really where oral narratives were centered and shared with the public as well.
It's also interesting, you mentioned this, but to watch the progress of technology in relation to this field, and having reel-to-reel tape, which was not easy for most people, but then it got easier with cassettes, but now it's even easier with your phone to record. So it's only become more accessible, I guess. And do you see that played out in the terms of number of projects or the number of places you help do oral history?
I think you're absolutely right. Probably the most recent phase of oral history innovation started in the 1990s, and it's definitely a time where technology was changing, and some of the first websites and digital archives with oral histories were starting to be established and became all the much easier and more accessible for local projects to be created. And I think also about this time, it's very interesting if you look back at American history in that historical moment, because in the 90s, scholars were in the American public itself was kind of re-examining U.S. history, around the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus landing in the Americas, the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. So this has really been a time, over the past 30 years of re-examining kind of these histories that we were very familiar with, and really creating projects that amplify marginalized communities. And communities are also starting to reinterpret their own version of the past. So I think this is a really fascinating political moment to see the ways that oral history can kind of bring complexity and nuance to our shared history. And I think you're absolutely right that technology is playing a big part in that.
In terms of what you're just talking about, social movements and capturing different levels of society, what if you were to give, say, 3 unique oral history collections that you've run across or participated in, what are some highlights just to give a sense of the range of who has been recorded?
Well, I guess speaking from my own personal experience, one project that I was involved in the early years of my PhD was this beautiful initiative called the Queer Newark Oral History Project. It's a lovely project with the LGBTQ community in Newark, New Jersey, and many faculty, students, staff at Rutgers Newark have worked on it as well. And the beautiful thing about the Queer Newark project is that it kind of arose out of the local LGBTQ community directly. There were some very difficult situations of violence that the community faced, and that brought the community together in a way, to support one another, to really want to complicate kind of the narratives about queer people in the city, and to really celebrate their heritage. So Queer Newark, a lot of grad students like myself had the opportunity to work on it, and that really, grounded me in the place and the space and the community of people, just as I was starting out my PhD journey. And there's even been a book that was recently written about Queer Newark, including a lot of the stories from the local queer community. And there's so much that's still being kind of envisioned about how these stories can be used today. Even walking tours have come out of it, doctoral dissertations, community events. And so it's really a project, of the people, for the people, and I'm excited to see where it continues from here.
Well, that's an interesting, I was going to get to this, the afterlife or the extended use of oral history. So, as an organizer of a collection or even like an archivist, you create the collection, and the hope is that people will listen to it and it'll have an impact. So what are some ways that you've seen oral history used, maybe unexpectedly or by groups you might not have thought would have been using it, that they've taken it and used it for whatever purpose beyond what you might have thought they would have?
I always love when there's some collaboration between oral historians and artists. And I think that there's some beautiful walking tours. I gave the example of Queer Newark. There's lots around New York as well. One I'm familiar with is at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which has its own museum. I got to intern there during my master's degree. And as, I guess, tourists and local residents come through the Navy Yard, they actually get to tour around to the different sites of where the ships were built. kind of tour through different eras of history. And part of it is listening to the stories of ship workers, of Navy veterans that worked on the yard. And so that was a really kind of special experience for me because my grandfather was stationed in the Navy just right outside the Brooklyn Navy Yard's gates. And so I got to kind of hear stories from him and then go and tour the yard and really, on these walking tours, hear some additional layers of the history directly from the voices of those who experienced and contributed to it.
You mentioned your grandparents, and I'm not sure if this is the right side of the family, but let's bring in your credentials as a connection to Long Island. What is your connection to Long Island?
So my paternal grandparents, they're amongst the immigrant families that first arrived through Ellis Island and then made the decision to stay in New York. So then through all the different generations, they moved first from Manhattan to Queens, and then eventually settled in Huntington in Suffolk County. And I have so many fond memories from my childhood of body surfing on Jones Beach and going out to see the lighthouse in Montauk and going to see my grandparents. We drive from Connecticut, we'd come down through the Throgs Neck Bridge and just this beautiful view overlooking the city. And so I always have a special place in my heart of going to Long Island on the weekends and the summers and getting to explore some of the local history of my grandparents.
That's great. So we just did a little mini oral history right there. We got your memories of Long Island.
Yeah.
So let's pivot in terms of the interview, right? So I myself have done oral history interviews. I've been doing this podcast for a long time, but it was a skill that did not necessarily come naturally. So if we flip the focus for a minute on the interviewer, the person who's guiding the conversation, what are some tips you would give to people or from your own experience, how to be a good interviewer?
Well, I like to think of the oral history process in 3 steps. And the first very important step is kind of all the preparation that goes in before the interview. The next is really honing down on the interview technique. And the final portion is kind of the post-interview processing. So if it's okay with you, Chris, maybe I'll walk through the different steps and we can talk a little bit more about interview technique. But, when you're first starting out with an oral history project, I think it's really important to, think of an idea, something that's really compelling to you and, something you can imagine just really sitting with for a long time and talking to people about at length. And then that idea gets refined, through local research, maybe at your local public library, historical society, and that helps you start refining your understanding of the history that you're trying to examine. Then I think it's important to kind of put together a project design and framework. And, that can be something as simple as just 1-page document that you can easily share with others and, workshop around a little bit. And I think with oral history, especially if you're recording a local project, you can create community partnerships, talk to local stakeholders in your community, and they can provide some input on the project that you're envisioning and also help you reach out to different networks of people that might like to be interviewed. It's also important to kind of identify an archive you might like to work with and an intended output for the project. So that could be a local historical society, public library, university library, community archive. And as we've already spoken about a little bit, oral histories can be used for blogs, for walking and audio tours, museum exhibits, podcasts like this one, documentaries. There's so many creative uses of oral history these days. And I'll just wrap up by saying it's also important to think very practically about the kind of equipment that you might like to use. We talked before about how technology has really made oral history much more accessible to everyday people. And so you can, connect an interview in person using apps on your phone. You can schedule an interview over Zoom. There's so many different ways of recording these stories these days. And then, finally, while preparing for the interview itself, it's important before you conduct an individual oral history, have a quick conversation with the person you're hoping to interview to break the ice, to share a little bit about the project, and to really prepare together to have a very intentional space for the oral history. And of course, you have to find a kind of quiet time and place to record the interview as well.
Well, the one thing I always worry about is have I pressed the button, right? So I'll be like 10 minutes into an interview and then I look over and say, is the light on? Is it actually recording? Obviously, you go to where the person is most comfortable usually. So, I've had to ask people, can your daughter stop doing the dishes? Or maybe let's turn off the TV while we talk. Any stories without naming names of interviews gone wrong or challenges that you overcame or just anecdotes of the interview process?
Yeah. Well, there's always the horror story. Every oral historian has one of forgetting to hit that record button, as you're saying, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays, for me, what I do is, even if I have my kind of high-end audio recorder with me, I always do a backup on my phone, just in case, because you never want to lose anything. But otherwise, especially in the summertime, it's tough to conduct interviews indoors when you have the AC going. And so you do have to usually respectfully ask your narrator to turn it off or to find a quieter space. Sometimes I remember conducting interviews at a community event. We're trying to kind of set up a place to digitize historical materials that a family has and to conduct a short interview. And, when you have lots of other background noise, that can be a little challenging at times. So I think you just have to be really intentional about the kind of space you set up and the expectations that you communicate to your narrator as well. But I will say, sometimes if it's the only environment you can record in, as long as you can hear their voice, I think, any recording is better than no recording in the end. And I'll just say very quickly, I think it's also interesting how people remember a particular time or event. And that's part of the oral history process as well, is understanding the misrememberings and why that might have occurred, or the meaning that people prescribe to a specific event or life experience. And I think that's also very fascinating to look into as you're exploring oral histories.
What that made me think of, so we've been mentioning the project we worked on together was the World War II Homefront, talking to people who had lived through the war years. And a lot of the people I interviewed had a very, probably rightfully so, but there was a sort of a golden haze on their memories, in a sense that everything was working, everyone was working together, which if you ask different populations, they might not have had the same memory. So can you say a little more about that? How do you deal with, or what are the aspects of this kind of perceived memory or their memory as opposed to ways they might misremember?
Yes. So as you mentioned, we were working on the National Homefront Project together, and that was an initiative that was created by my former colleagues at Washington College in Maryland. And that particular project partnered with community organizations across the country to record civilian experiences of World War II. And it was very important because, there were different initiatives that were trying to record the stories of service members who were stationed, overseas during the war. But this particular project was looking at the civilian experience. And, from the greatest generation, they experienced so much change in their lifetime. And by the time that we were interviewing them, they were in their 80s and 90s. And there had been a lot that was written about World War II, especially from the 1990s onward. And so even, very kind of popular films or books can then start to change people's memories. Maybe they look back on events a little bit differently. And so a project like that, really try to complicate these narratives and to maybe spark memories that narrators hadn't thought about in a while. And so I think all of our students and our community partners weren't afraid to ask the difficult questions. That includes some of the challenges that the people faced, living on the home front during a massive world war. That included losing loved ones to the war or having to go through using ration cards to buy everyday groceries, and even the racial segregation and repression and violence that was happening in the country during the war. So all of this is very difficult for people to remember, the very concrete details. But at the same time, it was such a vivid, coming of age experience for so many people. So we could kind of go back and spark those memories or complicate the narratives. And it all comes down to just the kind of questions you ask and not being afraid to occasionally challenge people as well.
What struck me is, and this is just one very basic example, but all the on Long Island there was a large industry, aviation particularly, creating building aircrafts, and basically VE Day, VJ Day hit, and a lot of these people were just laid off. The government contracts were up, so that economic aspect of the Greatest Generation, the companies basically said, you can all go home now. So it was not something I had factored into my World War II history that they were all laid off at the end of the war.
Yes, absolutely. Important to kind of question your own understanding of the war and, kind of put preconceived notions aside when you go into an oral history in order to be able to elicit those stories that may not be so mainstream or well known.
So when do you think you'll be sitting down for your next oral history interview?
Well, I just scheduled one today. It's actually out in Long Island. And I will be there, I think, in early August, recording some stories with anti-war activists from the 60s. And that's been a beautiful project that just began this summer. It's about documenting an initiative called Vietnam Summer, which took place in 1967. And it essentially created local peace initiatives across the country during the Vietnam War and had young people and educators and religious clergy members involved in having very difficult conversations about the war with members of the public, but to really try to spur them to action. So that's what I'll be exploring for my dissertation. I'm excited for my interview next month.
Anything I haven't asked you or anything else you would want to get across? This is sort of a general primer for people about what oral history is and some thoughts they might want to take with them. So any last thoughts you want to leave with?
Well, I'd say if you have an idea in mind, just do it. It might seem like from everything we described today that there's so many different layers and requirements for doing oral history, but really all you have to do is just sit down with someone and just listen to their stories. Maybe ask a few questions along the way. I bet they're going to be good questions too. But it's just such a special moment. You don't really have these opportunities in everyday life to just listen to our elders, to complicate the past, to see the world in a different light. And I'm sure everyone who's listening, has really a question they'd want to ask a loved one or a story they're really keen to learn more about in their local history. And so I would say just go for it, and all these other layers will come along and help support your project, and there'll be others that are interested in getting involved and supporting it. But the best time to do oral history is now, and I have confidence you're going to do a great job in recording these unheard stories.
And a big thank you to Erica for talking with us the other night, giving us a lot of that great background and insight into oral histories. We will have links in our show notes to information that Erica referenced, some of those projects, and more. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. And I wanted to get this episode out before the end of July. We are taking August off, so just a brief summer respite. We'll be back in the fall, ready to go. More episodes, more voices from the past, along with voices of people in the present who study the past. So thank you for sticking with us on this journey. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.